Agora eu vou chamar a Maia Olsen, ela é da Organização Mundial da Saúde e o tema da apresentação dela é o que esperar pós quarta reunião de alto nível da ONU sobre CCNTs e como os Thematic Issue Briefs da OMS auxiliarão para avanços nesse período até 2030. Maya, now it's your turn, and I'm very delighted to share the floor with you so you can share about the incredible work that you have been leading. Yeah, it's over to you now.
Hi, and thank you, Danny, and thank you for having us. Thank you for your patience on the English. I'm sorry you were not able to hear from my boss and our project lead, Katia de Pinho Campos, who is Brazilian and would have been able to present this in Portuguese. But thank you for your patience. The two questions that I was sort of asked to respond to was, as Danny mentioned, um, how can we kind of take forward the work of the WHO thematic issue briefs, and what can we expect after the fourth high-level meeting on NCDs, which happened very recently in September of this year? To answer the first question, I'm going to start with a little bit of sort of an explanation of what the thematic issue briefs were and where that fits within the context of WHO's work, specifically in the context of the WHO Global Coordination Mechanism on the prevention and control of NCDs. The GCM, the Global Coordination Mechanism, is a unit within WHO that's focused on strengthening NCD governance. It was established in 2014 by member states and the mandate was recently extended into 2030. The focus that we take on within the organization is around normative guidance and leadership, and looking specifically at multi-sectoral actions and the way in which multi-stakeholder engagement can strengthen the NCD and mental health agenda and facilitate knowledge exchange and joint learning between member states and across civil society, people with lived experience, communities, private sector, and many other stakeholders. The work within that has been twofold, as I mentioned. Some of our normative and leadership work has been around strengthening and sustaining the capacity of member states for coherent multi-sectoral action. Before we got to the issue briefs, there was two important pieces of work that was developed in the last couple of years. One was a global mapping report and an effort where member states from across WHO regions were asked to submit examples and best practices, lessons learned in effective multi-sectoral strategies in NCDs, and a technical process was put together to really map those efforts and understand what were some of the success factors and different components of what made those initiatives successful. Paired with that work was a compendium report that allowed WHO to work with member states to elaborate out a series of more detailed case studies. That's been a really great tool for peer learning and to better understand kind of what has been successful. Moving forward, we want to shift more towards implementation, and there's a new project we're hoping to move forward with that will be working with two governments on strengthening governance further in Ghana and in Sri Lanka. And then in this last year, a lot of our work has been focused on the high-level meeting and really putting the best foot forward in terms of collective multi-stakeholder engagement and advocacy in support of multi-sectoral action. So I'll talk a little bit more about the thematic issue briefs, which were co-developed by three of the participant organizations of the GCM, the World Obesity Federation, the George Institute for Global Health, and NCD Alliance. In addition to the work on multi-sectoral action, GCM and WHO has significantly supported efforts to strengthen member states' capacity for engagement with non-state actors. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of our work in meaningful engagement in terms of developing the WHO framework for meaningful engagement, which Carolyn also referenced, and some of the pieces there in both implementation and normative guidance. We also have supported work around decision-making guidance and support for member states in whether and how to engage with the private sector, which can obviously introduce some sensitivities and challenges. And so it really allows governments to be able to make that assessment effectively and strategically and with all of the conflict of interest and components in mind. In addition to the meaningful engagement work, there's also been some significant work in terms of community-driven grassroots innovation and community engagement. With the issue briefs in particular, this was one of the key pillars of civil society engagement and collaboration that we helped to facilitate through the preparatory process of the high-level meeting. It allowed a chance to bring these pieces together in advancing multi-sectoral action and multi-stakeholder engagement to really kind of embody that with an evidence-informed advocacy. And so there were 3 issue briefs that were co-written and supported by the 3 organizations that I mentioned. And the topics that each of those issue briefs went into was in the first issue brief, it was looking at institutionalizing multi-sectoral governance. In the second, it was really looking at data and at how to advance data-driven, evidence-informed multi-sectoral action. And the third was thinking a little bit more about narratives and the power of advocacy and integrating narratives to drive multi-sectoral action and to really build a narrative around the right to health. Those issue briefs, the publication was launched at the high-level meeting. Mark was very generously one of the speakers. We also had a colleague from the Brazil Ministry of Health who helped us launch that in New York, which was great. The issue briefs provide a rationale for multi-sectoral action, which is very important. Stakeholder-specific recommendations that sort of breaks down recommendations on those 3 topics across member states, across civil society, academia, private sector. And there's a lot of nuance and weight and important pieces there to dig into. And then it also provides a really helpful set of case studies that builds on the work of the compendium report. Some of the case studies in that look at how Philippines has helped lead efforts to have transportation and open spaces options that are health promoting. Ethiopia has a tobacco prevention strategy that has been an important lesson for many governments. Food choices in Mexico, there's a quality of life framework in Canada. Brazil, the case study in the issue briefs that we worked with Brazil on was around vaccine uptake, around the flu and HPV vaccine and some of the data systems pieces there. And so those case studies also provide another avenue to really kind of have peer learning and knowledge exchange around what has worked across countries. It also has served as an advocacy tool, and it was a kind of centerfold of some of the advocacy messages and kind of collective action in the preparatory process with the high-level meeting. And I think moving forward, there's a lot of opportunity to take some of the recommendations from the thematic issue briefs and look at ways in which that can be adapted and translated to national contexts. And we've done similar work with things like the WHO framework for meaningful engagement of how do you take the recommendations there, the principles embedded in the report, and really think about what is relevant in a country's sort of context and how to use that as an opportunity to have important conversations across stakeholders and with the ministry in terms of what needs to happen moving forward and national priorities for implementing some of those recommendations. Of all of the many different examples of multi-sectoral action that is covered in the that is covered in the issue briefs. I'm going to focus on the one that I was helping to directly support. On our team, I am one of our team leads that supports meaningful engagement. This will kind of complement what Carolyn presented on earlier, so I will try not to be too repetitive. But one example of multi-stakeholder action and one of the case studies in the thematic issue reports was the work of the WHO Symposium on Meaningful Engagement. And I think in order to answer the second question that I was asked in terms of what to expect after the fourth high-level meeting on NCDs, it's important to start with sort of how did we get to where we are, and what was the process that led into September 2025, and then certainly we'll talk about sort of what is to come and what to look forward to. So again, I will use this as a case example of multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral action. Our work and lived experience follows many of the same principles and activities, core objectives that I talked about with the GCM more broadly, providing normative technical guidance, supporting capacity building, leadership development, peer learning, contributing to evidence generation, and co-design and co-development of multi-stakeholder platforms like the WHO Symposium, like our civil society work that contributed to the issue briefs. With the symposium, like Carolyn mentioned, brought many different people with lived experience together in a platform that allowed the chance to first work together and work amongst the community of those of us with lived experience to co-create and develop a set of key advocacy messages, like in the issue briefs, that then were shared both online as well as with partner stakeholders and governments. And then it was very important in throughout the preparatory process for the high-level meeting, which was about 2 years of technical meetings on issue-specific topics, as well as kind of cross-cutting themes like financing. We were really intentional to make sure to have people with lived experience in the center of those conversations all the way through the process. This was both a very inspiring way to bring in multi-stakeholder action together. It also had its challenges. And as Carolyn mentioned, there is certainly a lot of variation and challenges in terms of how welcoming some of these spaces are to lived experience perspectives. We had to often kind of fight for space um, and were challenged by kind of the assumptions people had about what people with lived experience could present and how they could present. And so we were sort of focused on that all the way throughout. You can see, again, issue-specific meetings like humanitarian settings, financing. The WHO Symposium, as Carolyn mentioned, was about bringing the community together. There was also an opportunity at the end of the symposium process to bring those key advocacy messages to governments, and then individual disease-specific communities within the NCD space also led important dialogues, like in cancer. And then it kind of culminated in the multi-stakeholder hearing. And so this slide is borrowed again from some of our meaningful engagement work, but the UN multi-stakeholder meeting in New York was a key part of the preparatory process. And this was a chance for all of civil society to come together. So you can see some of the, this is a slide that shows many of the lived experience speakers who had statements throughout the day. There was also a really incredible set of civil society organizations that were really championing multi-sectoral governance and action, and uh, many of the key recommendations of the issue briefs, even though the issue briefs hadn't been published yet. This was an important um, an important milestone on the lived experience front. It was the biggest chance to have people with lived experience in front of governments sharing their perspectives. And it was, I've been in a lot of these meetings in the past. I've never seen kind of the floodgates open quite as much as they did that day in terms of how many strong lived experience advocates were able to get on the microphone and give really impactful statements, certainly sharing their personal experiences, but even more so, some of those kind of key action-oriented recommendations for governments, not just in meaningful engagement, but on these other pillars around uh, equitable access to care, multi-sectoral action. And it was really sort of, it was emotionally powerful and then very, very, from a policy perspective, a very strong kind of technical set of statements. Um, with both our work in multi-sectoral action and in meaningful engagement, there is implementation work that WHO is supporting as well. And so I mentioned some of the efforts underway to build on the work in Sri Lanka and Ghana when it comes to multi-sectoral action. With meaningful engagement over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been working in particular in the Eastern Mediterranean region. The WHO EMERA office has been leading effort on the ground with a number of countries to really take a look at the recommendations around meaningful engagement. And in the same way that we would hope to see with the thematic issue briefs, have looked to kind of translate and adapt the recommendations of the WHO framework for meaningful engagement into country-specific priorities for action and implementation. And so in Morocco and Jordan, that's been focused around coordinating uh, developing and kind of launching coordinated multi-stakeholder platforms for some of this capacity building and knowledge exchange work. In Egypt and Qatar, that's been really focused work around patient navigation and integrated care pathways. And in Syria, especially given the humanitarian context, it's been really focused on mental health and psychosocial support for people and families affected by cancer. Um, and so kind of in this effort to implement, not only has it been a helpful way to understand the stakeholder environment and kind of mapping the different civil society leaders in the space, reaching and working with leadership across the lived experience community and really identifying and championing those leaders, but then also the country engagement across those sort of multi-stakeholder platforms and multi-sectoral issues has been really important. And there's been a number of countries that have been part of that beyond the five that have been kind of funded and prioritized for project implementation. Um, in addition to this, I think one of the ways that GCM and this effort around multi-stakeholder engagement can be really effective is around evidence generation. And again, this is a little bit of a borrowed slide from our meaningful engagement specific work, but one of the important things with the thematic issue briefs is we did have people with lived experience as part of the consultation process alongside many of those civil society organizations that were leading the way. And we've seen that, especially in the last year, be really effective when it's come to recommendations around hypertension or some academic, kind of recently uh, academic milestones around a BMJ collection on lived experiences expertise. And so again, I'm using this as an example of where you can move forward in terms of taking some of the with the thematic issue briefs of where are ways in which we can kind of build those coalitions, further the evidence base, continue to share some of these examples moving forward. So what comes next? Where are we at? What moves forward? Um, so right now, as Carolyn mentioned, on September 25th, it was an unusual process in that the political declaration was not that had been kind of negotiated all throughout the summer. It was not approved. There were two countries that did um, make an objection, and so the co-chairs of the process had to make the decision on the day that there was not a consensus moving forward. That does not mean that it cannot still be approved. It's just a little bit more of a complicated process for the General Assembly to advance the political declaration. And right now we are sitting on a draft version of the declaration, and it's unclear whether or not there will be any changes if it is kind of advanced for approval. Um, What I did want to highlight with this is within the current draft version of the political declaration, there is some language that um, we were excited to see move forward through the negotiations that really highlighted the importance of multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder governance and action, specifically in the governance section, in making sure it's a whole of government, health and all policies, uh, a commitment around developing multi-sectoral national plans. And within that paragraph, the importance of engaging with people in community was also in the sort of central bullets around that, which we felt very good about. There's some meaningful engagement work acknowledging the expertise and firsthand knowledge of people and communities as well elsewhere in the document that my part of our team is also quite happy with. At the same time, you can look at this language and both from the perspective of governance as well as uh, civil society and those of us within the WHO, I think important to see governments commit to commit to these principles, and we certainly hope to see the declaration move forward. But what does that mean, and what does this look like in action, and how can we work together to support governments and to kind of have accountability that there will be action moving forward in these kind of dimensions that are in the political declaration, and then certainly sort of understanding what didn't make the declaration and what still needs to be a pillar of advocacy. I'm going to use meaningful engagement again as a little bit of a case study here. I think one thing that can help sort of understand where we're at is when in these big political meetings, one of the things that we did was sort of take a look for meaningful engagement in particular, what which governments were really kind of going out of their way. And you have a very short statement. There's so many national priorities that each government needs to sort of get on the table when they enter into things like the World Health Assembly or the UN high level meeting. And so we wanted to note in either May with the World Health Assembly or with September with the high level meeting, in either the general plenary or in one of the side in one of the panels, we noted where we took our niche but important focus with meaningful engagement and did note which governments had kind of gone out of their way to acknowledge and champion meaningful engagement. Um, Certainly, Brazil was on that list, which we're very thankful for. The countries in green were countries where we've seen them build in language in every meeting that we've been tracking this year. And so again, it's sort of a place to start when you think about how to kind of move forward with implementation and who might be kind of particularly interested in a certain topic. At the same time, sort of again, policies and language and commitments aren't necessarily action. And so I think where we're really excited with WHO to move forward is sort of starting with this set of countries, and really thinking about what's next and how can we as WHO support, how can kind of governments, what are their plans and priorities around some of the priorities that they are particularly concerned with, and really kind of what can we kind of collectively do moving forward to be successful in some of these areas. And so with WHO,
Maya,
GCN,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
oh,
we
I'm
are
sorry, am
really
I
running against
past time?
the
Okay,
clock.
do you mind if
Yeah.
I take 2 minutes just to talk about next
Yes,
steps?
please.
I'm so
I'm so
sorry.
sorry to interrupt
Oh, it's
because I'm
okay.
loving it.
I was just carried away. I'll be very, very brief. I think in terms of our next steps, we want to continue to build on this momentum and look at ways that I was mentioning to mobilize action and advocacy around national and global commitments, and to kind of work in support of member states in strengthening and sustaining governance mechanisms, multi-sectoral governance mechanisms. And then in particular with meaningful engagement, we want to kind of work with governments to develop more specific implementation guidance on how to move forward in those countries, because it's a relatively new part of the field and the framework is great, but there needs to be more operational guidance. In terms of ways that we can work together, and this is why I appreciate you giving me an extra minute, I do think civil society and forums like this, multi-stakeholder forums like FórumCCNTs, can do quite a bit in helping us continue to call for and hold accountable to action and commitment. I think, as I mentioned kind of throughout the presentation, I think there's important ways to explore opportunities to adapt some of these global documents, recommendations to a national context and to really work alongside your ministry and your kind of stakeholder uh, groups on that. And then stay in touch with us and certainly let us know where and how we can continue to collaborate. And I'm sorry I went over my time.
No, no problem at all, because this is all so inspiring. And what I appreciate about the work that you do is how much, of course, visibility you give to people with lived experience, their stories, and so on. But the amount of effort and love that you put in creating knowledge, evidence, and systematizing and sharing this with everyone, this is a huge piece of work. And yeah, it's very exciting, and I love seeing WHO doing such a piece of work with so many voices involved.